Greetings, I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast for all the returning listeners, subscribers, and of course, our very valued patrons. Thank you so much for coming back. To those new to the channel, thank you for taking a moment to check us out. If you dig what we're doing, please hit like and, of course, subscribe. That goes a long way in promoting the channel. Quick reminder before I bring the guests in, TIR is a listener-supported program. Without y'all, we couldn't do this. So if you enjoy what we do here on TIR and have the means and feel so inclined, become a patron for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. You can access our patron-only champagne rooms. Join us for our movie nights like we'll be doing this Friday. Because again, on TIR, it is Ninja Appreciation Month. We'll be watching Revenge of the Ninja after our Dating on the Left series. Get to have access to the TIR Discord, and you get the satisfaction of knowing that you helped contribute to the insanity that is TIR. Also, we will be going live tomorrow with our third installment of our Love on the Left series, this time discussing AI and dating. It'll be a good one, I promise. We will be doing our normal Saturday show as well. We'll be questioning the call by the FBA and ADOS movement for Black people to stay away from the anti-ICE protests in Los Angeles. Now let's talk about banned books and hip-hop. A dangerous book will always be in danger from those it threatens with the demand that they question their assumptions. They'd rather hang on to the assumptions and ban the book. That quote speaks volumes about the nature of censorship. While it's tempting to lay the blame for book banning solely at the feet of the current administration, the reality is that book bans are more common than many realize, especially in towns and school districts governed by conservative or religious school boards. Take, for example, a logging town in California where The Lorax by Dr. Seuss was banned for portraying the timber industry in a negative light. I am the Lorax, and I speak for the trees. The trees have no tongues. Today, we are joined by two guests who've co-authored a book for young readers that explores the historical and material conditions that gave rise to hip-hop. If jazz and blues were the soundtrack to racial repression and segregation, then hip-hop emerged as the soundtrack of a generation confronting dystopian destitution in the ruins of a once vibrant city, the Bronx, New York. If there's one major takeaway from Can't Stop, Won't Stop, it's that hip-hop was born from a place of cultural fusion. In a city like New York, a true melting pot. Immigrant and diasporic traditions from the Caribbean to the South merged to form what became a uniquely American art form. So why would a book about that history be considered dangerous? We'll explore that question and more with the authors of Can't Stop, Won't Stop, a hip-hop history for young adults. Before we bring them in, let's bring in the TIR crew. First, my homie, my dog, the Prince of Miami. He is the Pascal Robert. Can you hear me?
Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
She is the faceless voice of reason, the M2 Song.
Hello. I just want to say really quickly, I'm sorry to the audio listeners, but Jason, that is a very exciting shirt you're wearing today. What is that, like exploding pineapples? What's going on here? That's it's very exciting.
Can't hear you. My shirt's too loud.
Okay.
And I'm actually really excited to have these two guys on the show. These are two people I've wanted to get on the show for a long time. I don't know what happened in the air for my message to reach these guys directly, but I've known of Jeff Chang, for well over 20 years, because for those that watch the show, Coach Will was an intern at Soul Sides Records. I don't even think that's a label anymore. And there he would tell me stories about this really smart guy that did PR named Jeff Chang.
PR, wow.
Well, please welcome the co-author of Can't Stop, Won't Stop, Jeff Chang.
Hey, Jason. Hey, Pascal. Hey, what's up? Great to see y'all.
And also his co-author, maybe the most prominent hip hop journalist there is. And when I was a whistleblower at the homeless shelter I worked at, he was the only person that interviewed me. I bet he doesn't even remember that. Please welcome Davey D.
Pause. I feel good.
All right.
Davey's in the car like an angry right winger. But he's not Black MAGA today. We promise. There's no black.
No, definitely not. Definitely not.
Jeff, what year did this book come out?
The original came out actually 20 years ago this year. So we are celebrating an anniversary, actually.
Oh, what an odd.
Yeah. What an odd way to celebrate, right? To get banned by Trump and Hegseth. But yeah.
So before we even get into the questions about the book, I first want to ask you, what is your first hip hop moment?
Definitely trying to learn Rapper's Delight in the locker rooms with all my fellow folks on the basketball team back in the whatever grade it was. We were hella young, but yeah, that was definitely it. And everybody kind of doing that and double Dutch bus and the breaks, all of that stuff. So back in the day, yeah.
And Davey, what is your first hip hop moment that you can remember?
June 1976 on the Circle Line boat that goes up the Hudson River.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a guy that was playing records and kept playing the same part of the record over and over again. It was called Jam on the Groove. And these older folks that were on the boat started getting on the floor. They weren't spinning on their back, but they were doing what we now know as corkscrews.
Mm-hmm.
But I had never seen anything like it in my life. And I was asking, what are they doing? And somebody goes, they're breaking. And that was my first introduction to this vibrant culture we call hip hop.
And you were sold right there.
I don't know if I was sold, but I was definitely intrigued. I didn't, it wasn't something that I was trying to do. I wasn't trying to do that dance, and I wanted to know why I kept playing the same part of the record over and over again, and I wanted to hear the Jackson 5 and, maybe Dancing Machine or something like that, but they just kept playing that same part over. And later on, I got introduced, and I was formally introduced, and it was explained to me what was happening, and I've been in love with it ever since. I started out as an MC back in the days.
Are you allowed to say your rap name?
Yeah, Davey D.
Oh, okay. So you just kept your rap name.
Yeah, Davey D. D to the A to the V-E-Y-D.
Pascal Robert, I know you have a question. Your face is just lit up.
Yeah, I mean, I as someone who was native to New York City and, probably around the same times as Davey D's talking about remembers the development of hip hop, I'd like to know what was the impetus for you guys to include the role of the cultural diversity in the birth of the music that so many nativists today are trying to deny?
Well, that's an interesting question because there wasn't an impetus to include anything. People just were what they were. I hear people kind of do this revisionist thing, and I explain to folks that when we were coming up, everybody tried to be as cool as you could possibly be. So if you was from Jamaica, you didn't say you was from Jamaica. You just tried to be New York. If you was from the South, and I'm saying this is somebody who now is finding out after 30, 40 years that people I know are first generation from the South, they didn't say that when we were coming up. They just said, I'm from the Bronx. Other people, lost their accents, and everybody just tried to be as cool as you could possibly be. So we were New York, and whatever New York was at that time is what you tried to be. The diversity came when you went home, and you were trying to find something that would give you a fresh edge. So I would imagine if you was from Mississippi and you was looking for a breakbeat, you probably raided your mom and dad's Bobby Blue Bland collection or Muddy Waters collection.
Mm.
I went and raided my mom's, Carla McRae and Cab Calloway collection, and somebody else might have went and got their father and mother's Jamaican connection collection. So we brought our cultural aesthetics to the table and then acted like it was something like we invented, when really it was probably just a holdover of something that we've seen, heard, and experienced in our own homes.
Jeff, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think for me, growing up all the way on the other side of the world, like New York City was the Far East to me, So I'm seeing these kids doing their thing, right, via videos and movies that are coming out in the early '80s. And we're just like, wow, we want to be that. That was something that for us, it explained to us exactly about what young folks were up to. Because you get sold, even in Hawaii, on TV, this version of America or whatever, America colonized Hawaii.
Yeah.
And the popular culture, that's sold to us is all Brady Bunch, Partridge Family type of stuff, right? Eight is enough, whatever. And that's not us. Like we couldn't relate to that. But you start seeing kids of color, and they're doing their own thing. They got their own walk, their own talk, their own art, their own way of being. And that explained to us, oh, this is why we see all these buildings going up, and it's not owned by us, right? It's owned by like developers from the continent, American developers, or it's owned by Japanese developers, and so it's like this pre-political kind of thing. Like, I just want to spray my tag on that building. I want to spray my tag on that highway. And as it develops, we're drawn in deeper and deeper into this Black freedom culture. And we begin to learn a lot more about it. And I think that this is the moment where I'm entering, is the moment where hip hop is beginning to spread around the world. So by the time we get to the book, writing the book, as Dave is saying, it's just natural, right? It's something that begins with the Black freedom culture, and it begins with all these diasporic traditions that come together in a particular moment in New York City, in this abandoned neighborhood in the Bronx, where it's Black and brown kids in the 1970s. And then it begins to develop and grow, and it goes worldwide, and it gives everybody around the world a voice. And that can be that's problematic in a lot of ways. But it's also liberating if we stay true to those original ideas that were part of and seated within the culture from the beginning.
Jeff and Davey, how does the book frame the socioeconomic and political conditions that gave birth to hip hop, and why might that be uncomfortable for some readers or institutions?
I can't see it being uncomfortable because it's actual fact. It was the truth. And there were a lot of people from Ronald Reagan to Jimmy Carter who tried to capitalize off that when they ran for elections. People would famously come into the South Bronx and stand in front of an abandoned building and say, this is urban decay, and we're going to do something about it. They would look and they would brag that we're going to try and bankrupt New York City. That would have been President Gerald Ford. Like, tell New York City to drop dead. The police, at that time would hand out flyers and pamphlets talking about welcome to Fear City, right? And would outline a bunch of things that tourists should not do if they came to New York. And they would go there in plain clothes and give it to people as they got off the train. So, off the plane. So there were a lot of people that looked at the decaying infrastructure of New York, and they capitalized off it. We, when the book was written, we just really talked about how we navigated that. I lived in an area where you heard the fire engines 3 and 4 and 5 times a day, and there were burnt out buildings everywhere in particular parts of the Bronx. But when you're 10, 12, or younger, you're not thinking of this as being abnormal. It's the norm because hadn't been outside of New York, hadn't been outside the Bronx that much. So there was nothing really to compare it with and say, hey, this is really messed up compared to what other people are dealing with in another part of town. It was just what you dealt with. It was your life. And you found fun in it. You found community within it. You found a way to be creative. You found a way to create something where there ain't, as they like to say. And that's what we did coming up. As you got older, of course, you can have a sociological, social political analysis of the scenario. But I think coming up, it was just like my friends live here. There are activities going on. I want to be a part of those activities. There were community, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. There was a special moment those years of coming up and being a part of something that now is, become a fabric of the entire world, cultural fabric at least.
Now, Pascal, you were in the gang back in the day, the Black Jackalopes, was it?
I was not in a gang back in the day.
You didn't have the ducktail and the Lee jeans?
No,
that wasn't you.
The gang phenomenon in New York City was a little bit older than I was. It had started to clean up a little bit by the time I was coming around.
So the Wikipedia is lying, is what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that there was not a gang phenomenon in New York. What I'm saying is that it was a few years older than my own coming up.
That's what you're gonna say for the cameras.
Wink, wink.
Yeah.
But you know what? The gangs were your protection when we were coming up, to be honest, because New York, at least in the Bronx, it was heavily segregated. You couldn't go to certain areas. If you went, say, north of Castle Hill, towards Pelham Bay, or if you were in the North Bronx in Riverdale, where, I also lived there a period of time, it was, there were other gangs there. There were Italian gangs, Irish gangs, and they made no mistake of letting their racial animosity become familiar to you. And it was the presence, at least the presence of those gangs out of the South Bronx, which to Pascal's point was starting to die out and really get into hip hop. But those that were still around, I felt protected in my neighborhood. I felt protected knowing that there were black spades that lived in Soundview section, and I didn't have to worry about the white boys that were, enacting a thing that they called kill, the N-word day. That used to be a phenomenon in the late 70s. You go to school and you'd have to deal with that. So the racial animosity was there, and the gangs existed primarily in the beginning to shield us from that sort of situation. At least that was my experience with a lot of it.
We coming for you, nigga.
Didn't want to give you a flashback.
Oh man.
Jeff was like, I had no idea this was.
I'm so innocent to all of this. Yeah, I feel like a newborn babe thrown into. Never mind.
Go ahead, Jeff.
No, just back to your original question. Why it's so scary. I think to the folks in power is hip hop is a story of young folks over and over again coming together. Right, coming together to have fun, coming together to, despite having all this stuff taken away, right? Having schools closed, having social services closed, losing their shelter, right? So that all of these buildings are burned down, and folks are looking for belonging. They can't find it. There's no after school programs. There's no music programs. There's nothing like that. But they still figure out how to come together, through all of that. And the Ho Avenue Peace Treaty meeting was super critical to that, and in maybe transforming that phase of the gangs into the sort of post gangs phase, which of course there were still gangs, but it was less intense after that, right? People now had an outlet for things, and hip hop provided that. And that's hip hop's story. Over and over and over again, things fall apart. Young folks figure out how to put it back together again. And it's always the young folks who are at the bottom, the folks who are feeling it the most, right? So Dave's describing like the politics of abandonment, right? Like the from all the way from President Ford on down to the mayor, just pulling funds out of the Bronx. And this is now the kids are going to say, we're still going to have fun. So we're still going to figure it out. and that is the nut of it, right? That the unity that folks are able to find through all the different ways that they try to divide us is the story of hip hop. And I think that ultimately that's the story that threatens them, that really scares them, right? It's the truth that the truth makes them so uptight, like Sly Stone used to say, you know?
What do you and Davey, as guys that have been in different parts of the country, and you've been in the Bay Area or California for some time, so I know you've been in Los Angeles, which has its own very distinct gang culture that is extremely different from the Bay Area. What is it about LA that they can't have the same thing that you get with New York? I have my little tinfoil hat theories, but there's something interesting about looking at that gang truce you talk about with New York that comes out of the killing of
Black Benji.
like yeah.
Yeah.
Why can't LA do the same thing?
Well, I think it's a it's a it's a bit unfair to try to compare the two areas.
Mm-hmm.
I think LA has had its vibrant stories. LA has had its various moments of coming together.
Mm-hmm.
LA has a very rich scene,
Mm-hmm.
and you can look at various parts of LA, starting with Uncle Jam's Army when they were having 10, 12,000 people coming to the sports arena to perform. That was their equivalent to New York. They had a culture of funk and funk bands that came together, going all the way back to the Watch Stacks, all the way up, and that continued. And so, even though they quote unquote had a gang thing that was going on, we can get into a whole show and look at to why these things existed. The moments where they've had peace, the moments when they didn't have peace, all those sorts of things. That's much more detailed and much more nuanced than we can explain. We talk a little bit about it in the book based upon the people we spoke to. But New York and LA are two very, very different worlds in terms of how people engage one another. First of all, LA is a lot larger.
Mm-hmm.
It's a car culture. It's not one where everybody's walking, you run into everybody. You're not living on top of each other. There's different dynamics in terms of the racial politics. It's much more segregated than New York ever was.
Yeah.
And in spite of that, LA has a very vibrant scene. The thing that I often remind people is not to look at New York as being a jump off that everybody else followed, but to look at New York as having a scene that existed in the 70s and asking yourself, what was the scene like in Oakland in the 70s, and what was the music scene like in LA? What was the music scene like in Chicago? What was the music scene like in DC? And you find that there are parallel scenes. There's a go-go scene, there's a funk scene, there's a emerging DJ culture that emerges into what we now know as house in other parts of the country. And the common denominator is that you have young black and brown folks primarily who find themselves either victims of politics of abandonment, or in the case of LA, victims of the politics of containment, who come together and figure out how to create something that I think impacts the world. In LA, their dance culture eventually merges with New York's hip hop scene. And I'll close with this. When I moved out to Oakland in the early 80s, the reaction to their exposure to hip hop was not like, wow, this is incredible. How do we do that? It was more like, wow, that reminds me of something that I see my uncle do, or that reminds me of the type of dance that we do. So it was something where people had seen it, but it was in a different way. But I often remind people, we're people of the drum, we're people of oral traditions, we're people of dance. And you will always find that being created and recreated, different generations, different regions. But that is a part of that overall hip hop narrative. New York just had one that jumped off and captured the imagination of everybody, but it was one of more integration when it came to various parts of the country than it was one of like, wow, let's abandon our scene and then just adopt this wholesale.
Dave, you just talked about something that was very important. You're old enough to remember, and I think a lot of us are, to remember when there was a such thing called regional black music. Hip hop was just a regional black music of New York City, and go-go was a regional black music of DC. House music was a regional black music of Chicago, and even LA and all of these other cities had their own regional black music. And it's not till later on in the 90s where you see the hip hop become the dominant music that kind of takes away that musical and cultural differentiation that was so rigorous and vibrant beforehand. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, I think that regionalism still exists. It's a little bit smaller now because you have the internet. But then what you start to see, the regionalism exists generational versus, geographical. So meaning what the hip hop that my kids listen to is very different than what I listen to. My daughter was here in the car. She's listening to something that we call hip hop, but it ain't our hip hop, right? And I don't look down on it, but it's a very different vibe. It's a different drum. It's a different everything. But it is her generation expressing themselves, and they find community that may be worldwide because they're on the internet and they're able to connect differently than it was when we were younger. It was like we didn't have the internet, so you heard bits and pieces. So if I went down to DC and I saw go-go, and I remember that because I used to, be in tennis and go on tournaments, I would come back and try to explain, like, they got something where they playing these Congo drums and they're shouting all the time, but you don't have words for it, and I'm sure somebody from DC would come up and say, they do something that's like go-go, but it's a lot faster, and these dudes are doing Mother Goose rhymes. You didn't have anything to really, you had to, it was hard to explain until you went to those areas and then you saw it made perfect sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Jeff, what did you have in Hawaii?
Yeah. I mean, we definitely had the same kind of thing, and folks started evolving their own styles beginning in the late 80s into the 90s. And I think two of the thing that I was engaged in was graph art, graffiti art. And what you start seeing is a particular kind of style, particular kind of images and colors and things that are influenced by New York, influenced by what was even happening in Paris at the time, and folks developing their own styles out of that. And so, Hawaii gets put on the map basically through a lot of its graffiti art in the late 80s and the early 90s. And the movement keeps on going. And I think that's a beautiful thing that you're talking to, Pascal. Like, I remember in the mid 80s going to DC and seeing Chuck Brown and Rare Essence and, Stone Cold Hustler, right? DC Scorpio, all this type of stuff that was happening at that time. I'm going, wow, this is a completely different vibe. And then like Salt and Pepper go down to DC and they're sampling, right? The music that Chuck Brown is playing for their stuff to do My Mic Sounds Nice. And so there's a thing now where it's like, it feels to me like the regional vibe is still really deeply represented in the art that people do, the visual art, the graffiti art that people are doing, and then especially in the dance. And because we have the internet, that stuff spreads immediately. And so by the time you get to like the second or third revolution of it, right? Like, it's already just been a week, and suddenly folks in northern New Jersey are doing it, right? Or the suburbs of LA are doing it. And it's a completely different type of thing in terms of the speed of the adaptation of it. But it's a beautiful thing if you know what's going on. For us to be able to see folks doing turf dancing in Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl performance, that was like the folks are going nuts.
Yeah, that was actually
it was really powerful. Yeah.
Toussaint.
One thing I would want to add to what Jeff is saying, these are expressions. I like to say expressions more than art or anything else. And each region, each generation has tools that they bring into the expression. So the phenomenon we have here in the Bay Area, we have a thing called sideshows, people doing these crazy tricks with their cars. That's like a 40 or 50-year-old tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, because of the internet, you see people in South Africa and all those folks doing those things that we've seen in the Bay. But at the same time, they're also seeing the drifting that may have come out of Tokyo, or they might be seeing the stuff that was coming out of car culture in Los Angeles, and so you see them integrating some of that, and so you see, and that becomes a part of the tool. So like iteration, a rebirthing of hip hop. He mentioned the turf dancing with the whole hyphy movement, which the turf dancing is a part of. And so within that hyphy movement, which is, again, a rebirth of hip hop, what's central to that is car culture, where car culture wasn't central when I was coming up in the 70s or 80s. In another city, it might be Jeep culture. It might be another, Houston, they have a whole car culture that's connected to their music. And so seeing those tools be integrated into that expression, I think is important. So you have motorcycle clubs, bike club. I mean, people out here have the scraper bikes, so that became a part of the musical landscape as well. And I'm sure there's other things that I'm not thinking of, along with fashion and etc. So that's a part of the tools that people bring together and say, this is who I am for a particular region at a particular point in time. Recognize me and see me in my fullness.
Toussaint, you were a double Dutch champion.
Oh, wow.
Of Queens.
Wow.
What role did hip hop play in when you double Dutched with those plastic things on the end of your braids?
Oh my gosh. I didn't have those. My parents were Haitian. I had ribbons. So I didn't have the beads at the end of my braids and stuff like that much.
Do you get picked last for double Dutch? Is that a thing?
I've never mastered it. The ropes are terrifying. I've never been able to successfully get in and be in there for a while.
So you ruined the whole double Dutch line, is what you say.
Absolutely.
Don't let the ribbon girl get in. She foreign.
I never quite picked it up. Let's just leave it at that. There's a lot that I want to say. I absolutely love the book. And one of the things that I love the most about the book is how you showcase the diversity. And you definitely did not limit things to just being about rap. I think that that's super important in discussions about hip hop. So I'm also a visual artist. I really appreciate you going into the writer scene, and it was kind of separate in the beginning. Can you just expand on that? Because I think it doesn't get enough attention at all.
Yeah, I mean, it was part of what young folks. Dave could speak better to this, but it was part of what young folks were doing at the time, right? Kool Herc had a tag at the same time that he was DJing, at the same time that he was, gathering folks and in the parks and showing folks how to dance as well. As at the same time that he's inventing the modern MCing. So it was part of all the things that were kind of happening. I mean, Dave, you could talk to this a little bit more, how you saw that stuff taken off.
I think, the graph was part of the expression, but not everybody who did graph was into hip hop, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important distinction. When I lived in the Riverdale section of the Bronx, there were white dudes that did graph, but they hated black folks, and they might even put something that was racially insensitive in their tag, right? But they were, damn good artists. But at the same time, you had your Phase 2s and others who were part of, at that time, we didn't call it hip hop, but you could call it the Get Down or, park jams or whatever it was, jam culture, that came out of that space, who were also gifted artists. And I think there was an intentionality in the 80s when Wild Style came out in those movies, where folks were like, look, let's bring these elements under one umbrella. Not everybody agreed with it. I mean, I have interviews talking with Flash. He was like, I don't know if graph is a part of hip hop, right? Where others are like, it sure as hell is.
Yeah, Fat Five Freddy or those types of folks. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So again, I think that's an important distinction to kind of make. It's interesting you mentioned the double Dutch thing, because we wrote about that in the book, and I've always maintained that hip hop didn't happen in a vacuum. I know as an MC, my early rhymes were stolen from my older cousin who did do double dutch, right?
Mhm.
And I joke with her now, and
Yeah.
it's like, I took your stuff, thank you. I didn't make any money off it, so I don't have any royalties, but I sure as hell did, and then acted like it was mine. But the real interesting thing, if you look at 1973, and you say that's a jump off year, the Hurt Party on
Mhm.
August 11th, there are three things that are going on at that time. One, in 73 is the first year that you have the incorporation of the double Dutch uh, tournaments, right? So that's going on. So thousands of girls, black girls in New York, are doing double Dutch. Um, at the same time, you also have the emergence of the Fania All Stars and the salsa movement. That's
Mhm.
also going on in 73. And so
Mhm.
you have, these various expressions that are going on. And depending on who you talk to, some will say, oh, yeah, that did help me with my rhymes. And others may say, no, it had nothing to do with it. I'm going to be talking with Shaw Rock and Grandmaster Kaz tomorrow. And I talked to Shaw Rock yesterday, and I asked her, tomorrow I'm going to ask her if Double Dutch played any role in
Mhm.
influencing you as an MC. Now, when I talked to Debbie D, she said, yeah, it did. Shaw Rock, I'll find out tomorrow if it did. But the point that I'm making is that, again, these were expressions, and thousands of girls, black girls were doing Double Dutch in those parts. So I know I'm not the only one who stole their sister or their cousin's rhymes and used them. I wasn't trying to get in the ring with that and jump, but yeah, there's some rhymes that my cousin Denise could be like, he took my stuff.
I want to change the subject real quick though, if that's
Yeah.
cool. Because I just wanted to point out, man, 1973,
Mhm.
highly underrated year. Like everybody focuses on 1968. 1973 is the reason that we're all here on this call together. Like 1973, I feel like is when the culture shifted from like this imposed culture of whiteness all around the world to like this global popular culture that we have now, where it's a lot more fluid and where it's not necessarily like whiteness isn't centered. And I feel like that's part of the reason that Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth and these types of folks have to do things like book bans. They have to do things like saying to the National Park Service, like, we can't have any plaques here saying anything about like what happened when Indians were massacred here, or when Japanese Americans were incarcerated, or all those kinds of things. They have to censor that stuff because the culture is way beyond them now. And it happened in 73. Like if you think about 1973, right? Uh, you have Bob Marley and the Wailers coming out with Catch a Fire in the spring.
Mhm.
And one of the biggest albums on the charts, the top of the charts, is this album by a group called War from Los Angeles called The World is a Ghetto, right? And then you get to the summertime when young folks are just doing it, right? And Herc throws this party. Cindy Campbell throws this party and gets her brother Cool Herc, DJ Cool Herc, Clive Campbell, the DJ at it, and that becomes a jump off for hip hop. And just a couple of weeks later, Enter the Dragon opens, Bruce Lee. You know what I mean? So like that's the popular culture that we live in now. You got K-pop, you got car culture, right? With Chicanos and Japanese American influences. You got all kinds of things that are just jumping off. And those folks in the White House, that's what they're scared of. They look at this stuff and they go, hip hop. Hip hop's a problem. Hip hop's a problem for us because this is where all of these folks can speak to each other and they can actually have a conversation and they can actually uh, give respect to where it all came from, right?
And
In
the,
the first
and the
place.
key the key word is cultural conversation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, cultural conversation. If we're people of the drum, and this goes back to the thing about the folks that want to do this whole revision thing. No, when you're people of the drum, and I often remind people, nobody said turn the music off in the park, right? Even if you played a different drum, you might have been into salsa drums, but you wasn't like hearing funk drums coming off the turntable and going, "Oh my gosh, clutching your pearls. This is not what I want to hear," and vice versa, because it is the drum, and there's something about that spirit within it that you recognize and be like, "Okay, this is cool." Just like when I went to D.C. and I heard go go, I wasn't sitting there going, oh my gosh, let me cover my ears. This is just no. It's something. It's like a cousin. It's like okay,
Yeah.
this is different speed, different tenor, and they're not rapping the way that we do, but I get it. And when I moved out west and I saw people were into funk and they had a different way in which they stressed the percussion, which was, the Larry Graham plucking thing,
Mhm.
and that's their soundtrack out here. I certainly wasn't one who was from New York going, please turn that funk music off. It's hurting my ears. It's like, okay, this is a different vibe, a different rhythm, and vice versa. And I think that's important. We understand intuitively when we see a dance. We understand intuitively when we hear people, flexing their word skills, whether it's rhyming or just speaking slick. And we understand when the drum is banging. Like there's something about it that, okay, it ain't my rhythm because I'm from New York and you're in Cali, but I sure as hell understand the drum. And I think that's important because there are groups of people that absolutely hate the drum. And while we're embracing it, you have people going, let's ban the drum, or this musical percussion at Fisherman's Wharf at the same time that they're banning it in the subways in New York. Or, 30, 40 years later, they're like, please get rid of these drums in Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem at the same time that they're complaining about drums at Lake Merritt where we're at in Oakland. How does that happen when everybody is coming together and we're saying we love the drum, but there's a certain ilk of people that when they hear the drum, it sparks fear. And that's something that we have to kind of look at. We understand each other.
Pascal, are you fearful of the drum?
Nah, man, I'm not fearful of the drum. The drum often means revolution, man. The drum sparks all types of change and interesting developments.
Don't say that out loud.
But your drum has to be at least 180 BPM.
Not necessarily.
Check the body, check. If I had the sound drop for that, I'd play it right now because you want to hear it right now.
He's talking about my affection for house music.
I love house music.
Yeah, it's
house music.
all good.
We've done several. You guys have to come on one of our music shows. We actually do music shows where we do an entire year, all genres.
Wow.
And we've done several house shows actually with people that were the early, what would you call them? Producers, Pascal? Vanguard of house music, like guys that work with CeCe Peniston and
nice.
So can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Came up around this time. So in New York when we came up, disco was the enemy. And there was two types of disco. The John Travolta disco, which we hated. But then there was a thing people called black disco, right?
Yes.
Eventually you would hear at a place like the Garage, right? So my older cousins, they were like, I don't do this John Travolta stuff. But there was a whole level of disco that, that was funky. That just
let me tell you something. I'm glad you said that because I'm old enough to remember my cousin was a hip hop DJ in the late 70s. And his crew was called the Disco Crew. Right. I'm old enough to remember that you couldn't have hip hop without a connection to that black urban disco movement that was part of the music that came around as well, because it was all urban dance music. Right. And I remember how they tried to gentrify disco to make the music of the paisans, if you will. But the thing is, though, disco comes out of a kind of black and Latino urban dance phenomenon that is getting gentrified by outsiders.
Right.
But hip hop, a lot of the sound systems that were being played in discos were being tinkered with by early vanguards from hip hop. I don't know if you're familiar with this documentary, The Public Enemy that Chuck D did.
Oh yeah.
The Godfathers of hip hop. It's a very good documentary talking about the early days of rap. Yeah. And he's talking about how there's a fusion between early disco and hip hop that is often forgotten about.
Well, but we got to make a distinction because there were big arguments, and you're talking about the argument with the older cats in Brooklyn who were doing parties in the park and all that. So there were a lot of debates around that, but I want to kind of get into this. There was two types of disco. There was John Travolta disco that we weren't as black people welcome to go to those clubs, and that was Studio 54 that
Yeah.
wouldn't let you in there and all that. And then it was what we call, I remember people calling it black disco. It
Mm,
was funky. It had the gospel vocals, and
mm,
eventually that became New York City Club. That becomes house when Frankie
Yes.
Knuckles and all those people.
Yes.
So that was a different type of thing, and I say this because in the '80s, people who were into hip hop would also go to Paradise Garage, and
Yes.
yes.
folks were not. And just to show you how powerful the music was, if you're going back in the '80s, there's a lot of folks that are kind of schemish when you talk about gay folks, but they weren't schemish when they went to Paradise Garage. Folks
Mm,
would be there like, "Yo, I'm here, and I may be schemish, but I'm here to hear Larry Levan and his music, and whatever apprehensions I have are out the window because the music was such a powerful thing." But it was really for an older generation, my older cousins and all that. That was like
Absolutely.
that
Absolutely.
was their soul, you know.
mm.
Absolutely.
Loft. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And
I have a
Paradise
question.
Garage was a safe haven for
Yeah.
those communities. It was a safe haven for them to come
Mhm.
out and to express themselves.
Tucson, you said you want to ask something?
I do have a question because in the original book, you actually spend some time on reggae music
Yeah.
and Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me about that research? Tell me about reggae music in early hip hop. And did you actually go to Jamaica?
Yeah, several times. I was living in New York in the early 2000s, so it was an easy hop to get down to Jamaica, and I was also writing a lot about reggae music at the time, and also meeting Herc and Cindy, and asking them about their immigrant experience. But what was really interesting to me was the history of Jamaica and the role that culture played in it, like the culture in the form of reggae music, right? And
Mhm.
that um, here you have a third world country in which there's the Cold War is playing out. The U.S. is arming the conservative folks, and Cuba is supporting like the progressive folks in these elections, and in the communities, these guns are getting distributed, and people are having what is a gang war that's becoming a political war when you get to the election time, and into this, literally, Bob Marley steps into the breach, and is able to unify folks because he knows folks on both the sides. He's been through these neighborhoods because he's a musician, because he's sort of a ambassador to the world of Jamaica, and because he's adding a spiritual element to the music. He's able to be respected and revered and accepted as somebody who can be a peacemaker in that. And so for me, that was again like just something that's a story that hasn't been told in this international context and in this context of hip hop.
Mhm.
Um, but folks carry that vibe. Herc carries that vibe when he comes to New York, right? And when folks look at the ways that culture is able to create unity over and over again, this becomes sort of, in a way, for the narrative, like a blueprint, right? To be able to talk about what happens over and over. Like you talk about Los Angeles, right? Before the uprisings jumped off in 1992, before Dr. Dre and before Death Row and all that, like you had to have the peace treaty jumping off so that people could actually uh, see each other, right?
Mhm.
In the neighborhoods, they could mingle with each other, and I hear a record like The Chronic as a record that's a peace treaty record, right? Because and Snoop Dogg, Doggy Style, as a peace treaty record, right? Rolling down the street, smoking Indo, sipping on gin and juice, right? Laid back, right? With your mind on your money and your money on the mind, because you're not worried anymore about the dangers that you might be experiencing from from the colors that you're flagging or the neighborhood that the set that you're claiming or that kind of thing. You can actually hang out. So this is the kind of stuff that's getting played in the parks where folks are gathering after the peace treaty, right? And it happens again after Nipsey Hussle gets shot, right? There's another big movement on the ground to be like, what are we doing here? What's really happening, right? And that always, when you see these peace treaties, there's a huge creative explosion that comes out of that, and that inevitably impacts the world. Like it goes far beyond the neighborhood. And I think that that's part of the story that we're trying to tell is this is a story that begins in the neighborhood with Black folks, with brown folks, right? But that the reverberations of it echo literally all throughout the world. And so when you go back to that story of the tenement yards in Kingston, Jamaica, folks fighting with each other, right? And then you hear this reggae music and the unity that comes out of it, and the fact that we still all to this day, if anybody hears a Bob Marley song, they're coming down. There's not going to be like a riot if there's a Bob Marley song playing, or if there's a riot, it's a riot of people dancing, right? Literally like moving together, right? So we rhyme movement with movement. Like musical movements are social movements, and social movements have to be musical. And that's part of what we're trying to get across.
What was interesting to me when I found out that your book got banned, everyone I know that ever touched it never said anything like, this book is like a weapon. Everyone that read was like, what an interesting history that I didn't know existed. And they always come out of it feeling a little bit better. How did you guys feel when you found out that this book was banned at military schools?
Military schools, yeah. Well, again, we're talking about a situation in which these folks cannot stop us from getting together. They can't stop us from moving together, literally, like in time to the beat. You know what I mean? They can't stop it. So they have to forge all these laws. They have to pass executive orders. They have to clear out all of the people in government who are not going to be loyal to their line, their fascist line. And they need to be able to enforce this as if it were a military type of thing from top to bottom, because the people aren't going to accept that kind of thing otherwise, right? They have to be able to say, I've got the army here. I've got the National Guard. I'm sending in the Marines, right? That's what they have to do with all this stuff. So for us, we were shocked. We weren't happy about it. We understood that this book was getting banned, just as everybody out there has in these like school boards and libraries have been trying to ban books by and for and about queer folks, by and for about women and freedom, by and for and about girls who are asserting themselves, right? Like most of the books on this ban list, which we thought was about 200 and it's gone up to about 600 now, are literally by queer folks and Black and brown folks, period. Right? Indigenous folks, Black folks, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Latino folks, like queer folks, women, right? 90% of the books are 90% of the authors are these folks, and these are the folks who are trying to advance cultures of liberation. So we're in a culture war, and Trump basically is trying to pose white supremacy culture against cultures of liberation, right? Particularly Black freedom culture, right? And he's using culture to wreak war upon us, right? It's a war on culture, and it's a culture war at the same time. So the book ban is part of the same thing that's about trying to get rid of Lonnie Bunch, right? Who created the National Museum of African American History and Culture and is now the head of the Smithsonian, and they're trying to push him out, right? It's the same thing that's about banning science. It's the same thing about trying to fire all these people in the National Park Services. They're trying to get rid of everything that doesn't instrumentalize us into being workers and into being subservient to white supremacy culture, workers for white supremacy culture. And so that's basically what this is all about.
I want to add one other thing. Our book is a history book. And when you don't have a sense of history, several things happen. One, you repeat things, you make the same mistakes, and you don't build off the knowledge that has come before you. You know, there's the old saying about having generational wealth. I think this book is a part of intentionally trying to bring about generational knowledge. We're taking these histories, we're contextualizing them. We're very intentional about sharing these histories. We're making them digestible. And we also understand in the history of hip hop is that people learned history through these songs. People might say something, you're like, let me try and find this artist or this person that is mentioned. You know, I'm a follower of Farrakhan, Joanne Chesimard or whatever, when Public Enemy is saying that, sent you to the library. The other thing is culturally speaking, there's history. So, you're digging in the back of these records and you're going, where'd you get this from? Who's James Brown? Who's Sly Stone? Who's the Impressions? You're looking through these things and you are educating yourself and you aren't reinventing the wheel. And so when we're doing this in this book with this history and letting people know that some of these things, whether it's peace treaties, that it didn't happen overnight, it took 5 years in LA. It happened 3 or 4 times in 1971, or the meeting of the minds that was going on at Latin Quarter, which then influences some of the people who later would do the LA Peace Treaty. Those are histories. And those are things that people would go, let me build up on that. If we're mentioning Jamaica, let me go find out more about Bob Marley. If we're talking about Double Dutch, let me go find that history. So we put little tidbits. And in the book, we also understood that each region had its own history. So we gave little stories. Let's talk about Scarface or what's his name out of Philadelphia. We took these different cities and gave you little tidbits so you can go, what's the history in these places? And making history not something that is a very static and very boring thing, but something that is dynamic and very much connected to you today, which is a tradition that I think all our cultures collectively share. And so I think that becomes a very dangerous thing because they want to make something that history is either erased or it's irrelevant or it's something that's very, very boring. And so, by banning this, you continue this trajectory of what Jeff is talking about, not only of enhancing white supremacy culture, but you're also cutting the legs off of the attempts to build generational knowledge.
And we get multiple Will Smith albums. We haven't learned our lesson. So what happens when you ban a book? You get a resurgence of Will Smith.
I feel like it's time to play Summertime.
Tucson, don't you hate Summertime?
I love Summertime.
I love it.
Cool in the gang.
I don't hate Summertime. There's a guy that hates it. What's that guy's name? Open Mike Eagle.
Oh,
he
really?
went on a whole he said that it sounds like a PR campaign for the season of summer.
Wow. Well, Will Smith didn't even write it. It was written by Rakim.
Apparently, Will Smith says he was inspired by Rakim.
He was inspired
There are
by
conflicting stories.
Rakim's
He's
flow.
inspired by Rakim's flow.
I don't know. I wasn't there. I wasn't there when
Neither
it
was
happened.
I thought it was a good song.
He's got a new song out that I do not like.
Yeah, his new
Is that
album.
the one about the women?
I'm sorry, it's Girls, Pascal.
Oh,
no.
girls.
A 50-some-year-old man. It's all about girls.
Oh, okay.
Well, speaking of girls, I do have a question.
We heard the Double Dutch, so we knew you were coming.
Yeah. So the book that was banned is the YA version of Can't Stop, Won't Stop. So what is the difference between the one that most of us older folks read and the one that is being banned right now? It's targeted towards younger people, and so what was it being taught in schools?
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's why they pulled it. It was in the classrooms and in the libraries of these military schools, which are all around the world. There's about 67,000 students that attend schools on military bases, that the U.S. runs all around the world. So that makes Pete Hegseth the superintendent of education for what would be one of the largest school districts in the country. It's only 40% white because, as we all know, the armed services are primarily folks of color, and so what they did was, Trump on his first day passed this bill, or didn't pass. He forced out these executive orders that banned what he calls gender ideology, which I still don't get, and he banned ideas that are divisive to the armed services, and then he also, of course, went after DEI, discriminatory, what he calls discriminatory equity ideology. So it's adding gender ideology and equity ideology, and it's divisive to the armed services to talk about race at all. And so Pete Hegseth decided that in order for him to be able to make sure that he was toadying up in the right way, he would force the teachers, the librarians, the principals to pull all the books that would potentially fall afoul of these types of things. And we hit them all, right? We hit gender ideology. We talk about women and queer artists in this book. We hit equity ideology on every single page.
But
right?
we also talked about, we also gave a lot of love to white artists, and so we brought that to the table.
So that's undiscriminatory equity ideology.
But the other thing, the big difference is that we delayed the initial release.
That's right.
By a year and a half, and so that allowed us to cover the pandemic, which
Yes.
we wrote about.
Mm-hmm.
We also covered the Black Lives Matter movement at that time,
Mm-hmm.
which wouldn't have been covered had we not done it. And we also covered George Floyd, and we covered the 2020 election.
Right.
So there's a lot of things. We brought it up to date as you possibly could, and we went into a lot of details. And I mean, we were literally, as things were happening, we were writing. And, eventually got to a point, it's like if you add one more thing, we might have to delay it another year. So you better hand it in. But I think we were right up there to the election,
Yeah, we were.
Yeah. So
we were talking about Cardi B and Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
We were talking about all of that.
Yeah.
All of that.
So we covered a lot of things, and I think that becomes problematic because you didn't have a lot of books that are coming out, especially those addressing young adults that are talking about things that they could be like, I was a part of the pandemic, and we're not telling the story from some sort of clinical, stuff. It's like, this is what was really popping off. Here are the artists. Here's how they responded. Let's talk about D-Nice. Let's talk about Verses. Let's talk about all these phenomena that they can go, I knew that. I was there. I seen it. And I think that's going to make people become very curious. And at the same time, it's also unifying folks because they all have a shared experience with those three things: George Floyd, pandemic, and the 2020 election.
Mm-hmm.
Pascal, do you want to say something in closing?
No, I think that it was really important to address this book's banning and the threat that it makes, not so much to them, but to our telling of history, and why we have to be vigilant to make sure that we start to record our history and make sure that it's available for people to be able to access, because the state is now working vigorously to silence it.
That's
and
right.
We've got to counter that, and we can't really surrender to it, or else erasure is possible.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly the point. I mean, when you look at the books that they banned an indigenous people's history of the United States. They banned a queer history of the United States. They banned Asian American histories of the United States. Like, these are some of the titles that they went after. And the thing about it is from a technical point of view, they were supposed to review the books, but instead they just pulled the books out and they just filed them away. And here's what's happening right now, right? We should give you an update. Basically, they were supposed to come back 2 weeks. We had a hearing on June 3rd. The ACLU lawyer is representing 12 students who came together to fight this. And it should be mentioned that the only reason that they got to this stage is because there are huge walkouts that students on these military bases organized themselves on April 10th. So thousands of students from Okinawa to Kentucky were walking out because they were pissed off about this, right? So we get to court June 3rd. The judge looks at the government and they're like, where is the list of the banned books? And they're like, well, we don't have
My dog ate my homework.
Right, exactly. But we know that we banned 592 of them. So if you ban 592 of them, then you've got a list of them somewhere, don't you? Come back with that next week. So here we are. It's been like 2.5 weeks later. They still haven't come back with it. And this is the thing, right? The kids are out of school right now, right? The parents are still pissed off. The students are still pissed off, but they're not going to do anything on this probably until they start seeing protests jump off again in the fall, right? Just in the same kind of way that when Trump tried to put everybody, the Marines and the National Guard into Los Angeles, he was also like, oh man, we better stop doing these raids on the restaurants and the hotels because gosh, that's going to actually eliminate a lot of the folks who are on staff at Trump International hotels, right? So that's, and then of course they said they reversed it, and so who knows what actually is going on. But my point is that we still have to be out there in the streets, literally. We have to be out there in the schools. We have to be out there in the national parks. We have to be out there at the museums, defending these institutions and defending our right to be able to pass on our knowledge to each other, to the next generation of folks. This is what they're going to get fortified with, and this is exactly what scares them the most, right? That we're going to be able to pass on all of these things that folks will learn, will react to, and that will move them in a direction that's counter to white supremacy culture.
Well, I have to ask you guys a question. We usually go after the main show into a place we call the Champagne Room behind a paywall where we can say more curse words and actually play music here and there without YouTube pulling it down. If I sent you guys a link, would you join us for even 10-20 minutes?
Happy to join for a little bit. Yeah.
Davey, can you do that from the car, or do you have to?
I'll be driving.
You know what? That might be dangerous, y'all. I've seen. I've been in the car. Oh. I just want to say that. But public safety is very important.
You can cuss people out, and all the nice things you said will just get thrown out the window. Just all the N-words.
Yeah. Oh, gee, Dave just signed off.
Yeah. I guess these niggas are done.
Wow.
Damn.
That was real.
That was the blackest interview we've done so far, Pascal.
Pretty crispy.
Walked out on us like George Jefferson. Well, Jeff, Pascal, Toussaint, I'll email you guys all a link to the Champagne Room. If you want to join us, it's patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. Wherever you're watching or listening to this show, there's a link in the description. I have some hip hop questions I have to ask Jeff that I saved for behind the paywall.
Okay.
It's going to be some old guys yelling at trains.
Oh.
So I think all of us, I have some gold. I've been wanting to do a whole series on the golden era of hip hop. Why is it the golden era of hip hop? And I have some theories. I want to run them by people that were there. So,
okay.
Pascal, you down for that?
I'll try to be there.
Wow, no problem.
Damn, this is double. There's two black, too strong today. Damn. I need to get more.
Davey. He's getting Davey's car.
Yeah. Need more white people on this show. That's what it is. They'll show up.
Oh, okay.
So I'll look out for that email. It's coming in 2 seconds. Thank you guys. And we are
out.
Cartoons.
Out.